Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Nick Reynolds. I'm the research analyst for land warfare at RUSI, and it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Matthew Ford and Professor Andrew Hoskins, the authors of Radical War, Data, Attention, and Control in the 21st Century. Now, Dr. Matthew Ford is the Senior Lecturer in International Relations at the University of Sussex. Previously, he wrote Weapon of Choice, which looked at Western military innovation through the lens of small arms development. Professor Andrew Hoskins is the Professor of Global Security at Glasgow University, and he's also the editor of the journals Digital War, Memory, Mind and Media, and Memory Studies. Now, firstly, for some housekeeping, we're going to have a talk from the authors for about 25 minutes. And then we'll move into the Q&A. When it comes to the Q&A, please put any questions into Zoom's Q&A function. And also, please feel free to upvote any particular good ones. I will choose and relay them to the panel. Regarding attribution, we are under RUSI rules. Now, for those of you who haven't been to a RUSI talk before, that means that the talk is on the record, but the Q&A is off the record. I'd also like to note that the YouTube live stream will cut off when the Q&A starts. So if you are viewing by YouTube but want to take part in the Q&A, please get onto Zoom if you wish to take part in that. The link should be up on the RUSI website. Now, Andrew and Matthew, your book is actually extremely timely, as we are seeing in Ukraine. As a latest example, the general public internationally have far better access to information at a really granular level from so many angles about how the war is proceeding than any previous conflict, which is something that you dug quite deeply into. But anyway, I don't want to steal any more of your thunder, so over to you.
Nick, thanks, and thank you for hosting us and giving us the opportunity to talk about our book, Radical War. Yeah, I think the fact of the matter is we wrote this book before the war began, and our reference points were Myanmar and other Syria and other wars where there was a lot of connectivity, a lot of smartphone technology, internet access, and all the rest of it. And I think it's fair to say that I think we spent the first month or so thinking, crikey, we've got a book out, and how wrong is this book going to be? Because of course, there's nothing like a war to completely show that whatever you thought before the war, it's all changed. And of course, in the context of a state-on-state war between Russia and Ukraine, our challenge was, well, this is a conventional war. Under what circumstances are you going to describe any of this about information, or how's cyber going to play? How do information infrastructures or the media ecology, how does that all blend and make help us understand, or how does it reframe what we think about in terms of conventional war? And so in some respects, we spent the first month or so wondering how wrong we were, and hoping that we weren't as wrong as we. I mean, the book wasn't about prediction, but it was about trying to understand how these devices affected how we came to understand and make sense of war. And in that respect, we were interested in how people can participate in conflict using and how war is represented through their smartphone. Because you don't have to you go on the tube in London, you go on the train anywhere in Europe. Everyone, when they're looking at their phones as they're traveling around, they're engaged. The war is literally in the palm of your hand. And of course, it's not just in the palm of your hand for us as watchers from remotely, as it were, but it's also in the palm of the hands of those people who are in Ukraine, who are actually capable of recording, publishing, and then participating in the war right on the front lines. And if you have a smartphone in your hands, right down in the Donbass, I was reading an article the other day. People are playing computer games on their smartphone. Just as much as they're communicating with their mates at home or their family. And of course, that creates all sorts of tensions and challenges for people who are trying to manage information flows from the battlefield and that also creates all sorts of tensions in terms of information war and electronic war and all of these other bits and pieces. So, you know, the last few months has been a bit frenetic for me, just to try and understand what imagery is coming off the battlefield. Where's it coming from? Is it headcam footage? Is it smartphone footage? What's the relationship between that and mainstream media, where you've got broadcast media and traditional newspaper media? How does all of that relate? And, you know, under what circumstances is the stuff that's coming out online ahead of the stuff that's being broadcast in mainstream media? Andrew, I don't know whether I've
brilliant
enough there.
No, great intro. Thank you, Matthew. And thanks, Nick, again, and Rusi for hosting us. We really appreciate it. Yeah, so let's just drill down into kind of an example then and clarify a bit more about what radical war is as far as we can see it. I mean, I'm sure many of you have seen or heard the news yesterday and today about the death sentences passed against Sean Pinner and Aidan Aslin by the so-called Donetsk People's Republic in Donbass. And listen to the news of that. It's really interesting because it's clearly newsworthy because of claims about war crimes being committed, breaches of the Geneva Convention, and it seems to us that all seems legitimate and newsworthy, and the mainstream media around the world have jumped on that as an example. But what's really astonishing, I think, is the ways in which mainstream media give us a very contained version of this war. So, you only have to go into Telegram, and 70% of Ukrainians use the social media platform Telegram. And I can actually download on my computer, many more breaches of the Geneva Convention, many more war crimes than the entire BBC have in this week's news. So there's a real disjuncture for us between a kind of a mainstream perception and understanding and representation of war, what war is and how it works and how it functions, and what we call radical war, which is actually much more complex and much more extreme. And so there's a problem mainstream media have then of how do they begin to represent or comprehend what's going on in Telegram, for instance. So for us, Telegram is definitely the heart of the digital battlefield. Let me give you an example. If you look at the Look for Your Own channel, it's basically a stream of war porn, unadulterated photos and video of dismembered bodies, presumably Russian soldiers and captives, but also bodies of civilians, including naked children. And this was created by the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine to kind of identify, capture and kill soldiers of the Russian army, and it's a whole stream of these images and videos with lots of emojis and celebratory comments and messages and cheers. But where do we see that? It's there on Telegram with a million followers versus what I watched on the BBC this morning, where a lot of legal experts were going on, is the death sentences of these two really unfortunate individuals a war crime or not? And I'm not, disputing it. It's not war crime. I'm not taking away from it. That's awful, what's going on in Donbass. But I'm trying to give a sense of the difference in scale. So radical war is about how do you penetrate the complexity and scale of our digital media environment, because we can't do it, as academics. What about militaries? What about governments? What about mass media? What about civilians? What about journalists? Together it's an extraordinarily complex picture. So like Matthew, can I just say something about, give it more of the sense of a scale before I pass back to Matthew, because it's a really important part of our argument. In the late 20th century, we used to measure and understand war in terms of radio and TV coverage, could measure it in hundreds of hours. Okay, so I did my PhD in the mid 1990s. I looked at hundreds of hours of video of the 91 Gulf War. Okay, that was my corpus. So, we could measure war, get some sense of it being contained and comprehensible, understandable by that kind of measure. So hundreds of hours. But today, if you talk to NGOs such as Mnemonic, who are responsible for gathering images and videos and texts and messages for potential future prosecution of future war crimes, they tell me that for the Syrian war, which 10 years, over 10 years for the Syrian war, they've got 40 years of footage. So I had to wheel back and say, can you say that again, please? And they said 40 years of footage. That's around 3.5–4 million records. But for Ukraine, in only the first 80 days or so, they've already got half of that. And it's an astonishing difference. It is incomprehensible. I remember 6 months after 9/11, watching a documentary where they proclaimed that 9/11 was the most documented event in history. And I thought that was the extraordinary claim. How can 9/11 be the most documented event in history in 2001? What about the Holocaust? What about World War II? What about World War I? And all the video and images and documents and books written about these enormous and awful and huge events. But now we can say most categorically, the Ukrainian war is the most documented war in history and probably the most documented event in history. And so our understanding of what war is in real time and over time has utterly transformed. So how do we make sense of that glut? So for us, how people make sense of it, well, you narrow down. It's a kind of subscription war. You subscribe to your own channels. You can't possibly deal with this information overload. So the real paradox for us is, massively more information, less understanding, more subscription war, more narrowing down, more extreme perceptions of what war is, and overall it's a it's a very uneven, what we call a new war ecology.
So, and the thing is that these devices, if I think Wired reported that 62% of the Ukrainian population have smartphones, and on that basis, that sense making, that challenge is being reproduced by the fact that everyone is a sensor, right? And I think that was the thing that I was trying to check really as we could see the challenge of sense making, but because of just the amount of material that was being produced on a day-to-day basis through everyone's interaction with each other on social media, just producing data. And of course, people are willingly participating in their own surveillance because they gain so many benefits out of doing so, in terms of whether it's in terms of special deals or special offers, or if you're going on the train or also, getting on the bus, all sorts of ways of using your phone in order to get access to cheaper deals and all the rest of it. And of course, that is a social divide because some people have smartphones and some people don't. But if you've got this smartphone, the really remarkable thing for me was that, of course, it's a sensor. It's a camera, it's a microphone, it's something that you can use to geolocate images. And of course, we're seeing a lot of effort going into open source intelligence work that's built around people taking snapshots of things or taking film and then trying to geolocate it and all the rest of it. But what was really, and this is picking up on the point on war crimes, what was really amazing from our point of view, was seeing that actually someone had built an app that would allow them to standardize the open source collection of information from the battlefield, which could then be sent up into fusion cells within the Ukrainian armed forces, and which could then be combined with other sources of information that would allow the whole process of targeting. So effectively, the smartphone becomes a place where you can propagandize, and it's a place where you can target. And you can do battle damage assessment, and all of that is built out into the civilian population. Suddenly, the whole targeting cycle becomes highly resilient because it's not dependent on the armed forces. Some work clearly needs to be done to understand the extent to which the smartphone as a weapon, how much of that is a gimmick, because of course we're looking at what's going on in Donbass right now, and it's quite clear that the poor Ukrainian infantry are really getting it hard, from as an artillery war. And at that point, it sounds a bit gimmicky to say it's a smartphone war. But at the same time, if civilians have this app and they are recording the movement of Russian columns, and then you're hearing reports of Russians shooting civilians on the basis that they were worried that they were being watched by people with their smartphones, and they're actually physically going through your smartphone in order to establish whether you've been recording stuff, suddenly you've got a whole series of challenging scenarios around the role of civilians as combatants and participating, not just in terms of propagandizing war, but actually directly involved in the targeting cycle. And go back a step, of course, smartphones are designed for use on drone technology, civilian drone technology. Effectively, you can. I've seen great videos of Ukrainian armed forces firing mortar rounds and then having a civilian drone which is broadcasting back. They're adjusting fire. Okay, fair enough. In Syria, we've seen bits and pieces of that before, but now, of course, your smartphone's connected online, and so you can immediately broadcast that up online, right? And I think one of the things that really struck me was trying to understand the media cycles. How quick was information coming up from the battlefield that from people broadcasting directly from their smartphone compared to stuff that was coming up through mainstream media. And at least at the beginning of the war, a couple of open source intelligence people said, it's a good 12, 24, maybe 48 hour wait before stuff was being broadcast. And of course, that reflects different social media channels, Telegram being one of the challenges early on was to understand where is the war online. And as Andrew said, it was being broadcast it has become broadcast via Telegram, not Twitter, Facebook, or the other platforms. And suddenly you realize that there's an entirely new, the Twitter, Facebook, these are mainstream social media platforms with a different ecosystem and a different culture of engagement and a different way that people make sense of what's going on in front of them. And all of that is being delivered into their feeds asynchronously. So it's really hard to understand at what point this battle, a particular battle is unfolding. How do we make sense of that in real terms as someone's broadcasting something from a drone? I mean, some of this stuff is really remarkable. At the same time, we've seen some of this early on in Myanmar and in Syria. But when you've got the scale of connectivity we're talking about here, and it is. I think it's going to be a real challenge to try. I mean, on the one hand, of course, there are lots of people who are helping us try and make sense of some of these things and create some narratives about how the war is unfolding. But of course, that itself then becomes potentially not, that becomes a received view, which may in itself need to be revised once people go back and look through the material that's online. But as Andrew said, with whatever it is, 40 years worth of material in 80 days.
Well,
it's 20 years worth in 80 days. Sorry if I got the stat wrong. But that's amazing. How do we do that? And I think that was the question that we put in our book. All we're trying to do is map how we understand, how we might make sense of the digital ecosystem across what we call data, attention, and control. That's the premise of the book as we put it together. Andrew, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, not at all. No, I mean, we talk about splintered realities, really. That's what radical war is, about how individuals come to experience and fight war, I mean, via the smartphone. And of course, there's the old trope about the history of war is often written by the victors, but the history of this war will be written by the victors and by the losers. Such is the kind of splintering of realities through which we come to fight, experience, and remember and historicize war. And a key part of our thesis, a key part of our radical war book, is focusing on the nature and potential and function of memory and history within this digital environment. So, surely the most documented and the most personalized war in history, will transform how and why it will be remembered and historicized. Choose your own war, select your own memory. It's as simple as that, really. And if we compare, war and memory of the 20th century, people often say to us, well, it's just the same as the 20th century, isn't it? It's just changed a little bit. No. In terms of memory and history, then think about the Great Wars, the Holocaust War, the Vietnam War, the Falklands War. I mean, these wars were all marked by relative silence after them, subsequent periods of private recollection, denial, unspoken trauma, honoring the dead, it was only much later, 20, 30 years or more later, that all of the wars I've just mentioned became gripped by what we call today the memory boom, the unstoppable cycles of memorialization, commemoration. And of course, the official history of war tends to be written not only by the victors, but it's also highly sanitized. Exactly our point earlier about what mainstream media are doing to this war, when the unsanitized war is actually unlimited and absolutely available to everyone. And so what kind of memory then is being produced from the millions of smartphone images and videos? There's no gap, there's no space, there's no reflection. And I mean, soldiers, of course, another example, have always taken trophies from the battlefield and captured illicit images of their kills. But the difference was, in the 20th century, these weren't shared with millions of others at the same time via telegram, and a matter of minutes after they were taken. And you look in Ukraine now, selfies taken by civilians in front of burnt out tanks and other destroyed vehicles across Ukraine, still with the body parts of those killed inside, a kind of splintering of personalized images. So this is a very different war, and it will produce a very different memory and a very different history. And our book and our work is just about beginning to grasp the enormity of this transformation. What kind of memory will be produced from the millions of smartphones and images and videos? It comes back to our splintering of realities. What we have is Radical War is this new and instant and graphic memory of war. It's kind of, in many ways, there's already a radicalization, already a weaponization of memory through the media, in which the memory of these events, are being fought over in the present. There's no time for kind of any settlement, for any kind of reflection. And unfortunately, this war is not going away. So, people talk about forever wars and continuous wars, but this is very different. This is a highly personalized war. Choose your feed, choose your war, choose your memory, and it will transform how war comes to be remembered, forgotten, legitimized, delegitimized, and experienced in the future. It's an utter transformation, and that's really for us what Radical War is about. Matthew?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, of course, this does present all sorts of enormous challenges for those who might be involved in trying to manage information and the information war, as it were. And it seems to me that one of the things that we definitely had early on was an indication that there was an info war already pre-scripted, as it were, that was trying to shape the way. I mean, how many times did we have the Russian campaign compared to the the Finnish Soviet war just before the beginning of the Second World War? It's that in many respects had to be, I think, pre-scripted, and of course that involved the IT army of Ukraine, and also this is about crowdsourcing how narratives might be presented, and I mean, and very successful it was as well, and that as a distorting prism for framing how people have then gone on to interpret Russian activity is fascinating to watch. A lot of the time we are regularly pointing out how we're seeing commentators regularly point out how inadequate the Russians are in terms of their military capability and training, and the Potemkin army and all the rest of it. And of course, I don't doubt for a moment that there are lots of reasons in there to believe some of these narratives, right? But they also mask our capacity to make sense of what the Russians may or may not be actually doing, and so that sort of feeds our own biases, and that then becomes a sort of form of, as Patrick Porter would describe it, a military Orientalism. We're seeing Eastern war through Western eyes, and that itself makes it harder for us to see the war as it is, rather than as we want it to be, and that can be really distorting in terms of what the net result will be in terms of people wanting to draw lessons and try to understand what the implications are. And unless we make a point of trying to go back to some of the evidential basis that Andrew's just been, and also recognize just how hard that is, right? we are going to struggle to draw some. There is a danger that we are going to mirror our own preferences about how war will be into the material that we're seeing. And anyone who's worked in the intelligence community will know that that's a very challenging space to be in, because we'll end up, there is a real danger that we'll draw the wrong lessons from what's been going on in Ukraine. So go on, Andrew.
I just note we've got lots and lots of questions building up.
Oh, yeah, good.
I wondered maybe we should stop there.
Yeah, I was about to say, yes, I did notice there are a lot of questions, and actually just reading through all of them, and I realized we might not even have the time